the festival dedicated to the assets of the top officials of times of Yanukovych. We were talking about the criminal cases of those days. You all agree that a lot of time was lost, and that could be one of the problems. I heard it many times that time lost is one of the biggest problems, why it will be difficult to bring to end these cases and to return at least some assets. And our final panel is assets which are still to be returned. And we decided to dedicate this last panel to cases, to what journalists discovered related to the current uh, civil servants, those who are in Ukraine who did not run away anywhere, they go to work, to the cabinet of ministers, and we'd like to talk to recollect the cases of my colleagues on today's officials, on some findings that have become known to journalists, and how this story was moving on, how it ended, and besides my colleagues, we have the detective of Nabu, Artem, and I believe that is the reason why we will have very interesting discussion. We know that Nabu files the cases, works with materials published by journalists, and will be able to talk about how this works when Nabu takes some materials published by journalists to their attention. But first we'll talk about interesting cases when journalists found some assets of people who are known. Lena Loginova, Евгений Motorevsky, Litvinfo, схемы program Mikhail Tkach, and or Bigus Info. What do you call it now? Bigus Info. Nadia Burdey. So the first one will be Zhenya Motorevska. It's on the case of Demchinov. Good afternoon. I will start from reminding you who is Pavlo Demchinov, why people are interested in him. He's the first deputy of SBU and a friend of Igor Kononenko. If not a friend, then a person close to him. Why we're interested in him? Because there are many corrupt stories. When I met with my insiders, they would tell me that in the story with Amber, it's all under Demchina. In the story with Walnut um, Mafia, it's also Demchina. In the history with liquefied gas, when they were promoting some specific importers, that was all related to Demchina. We realized that's a very corrupt top official, a person who has influence. When I started looking at his declaration, the security service officers do not supply the e-declarations. I saw that he doesn't have any assets, neither cars nor real estate, and I started to check. And I found out that as of 2015, the person who was Major General and then Lieutenant General lived in the security service hostel. No one saw him there, of course, when I went there. When we asked, is that true that the deputy head of security service lives here? The only thing that we had in declaration were the last name and initials of his 3 children. It was difficult to understand who is the mother of these 3 children. And this way we discovered the lady, the woman with who he just resides. It's not his official wife. And we found out that that civilian wife with who he has been for 5 or 6 years is quite a wealthy person. She owns 4 cars, 2 of them are Lux class, new Mercedes, new Range Rover. The total cost of the cars is about $300,000. Range Rover and Mercedes is like 200,000, and 2 more are the cars which are used by their relatives. Besides, we found out that Pavlo Demchina, who's officially registered at the dormitory, has been living in quite an expensive and beautiful mansion, which is in Petropavlivska Mezhyhirya, which is close to Kiev. And we waited long near this building, and we managed to register when Pavlo Demchina was picked up from this house by a car. And this way we proved that he uses this mansion. It's difficult to say what's the cost of that, but we can say that it's up to $1 million. It's not in the register. It wasn't commissioned, but we found the relatives of his civilian wife, and we could visually say that it's more than 300 square meters, and we see there are some additional buildings there. That's the house with the swimming pool. In Kiev, such a house could cost up to $1 million, depending on what's inside. But basically, that is does not correspond to his official income. And why is this case interesting for us? And the National Anti-Corruption Bureau filed a criminal case after our investigation. We talked to detectives. They did a lot of work, a lot of information was collected, at least what we see in open sources in the judicial register. And when we talked to Mr. Demchina, he was saying, that's all mother of my children. I don't know where he got it from. When we met, she had it all. And we found out, the detectives confirmed that Demchina resides with this woman. And secondly, they found out that her income in 5 years is, in 5 years she earned less than 200,000 hryvnias. This money wouldn't be enough even for gasoline for their 4 cars, to say nothing about money they would need to live on. Then a few weeks ago, Valeria Yevgoshina from Schemes prepared one more material on Demchina, where she showed relatives of his wife. And basically, Mr. Demchinov provided everything, not just for himself and his civilian wife, but for his parents, his relatives, and the relatives of his civilian wife. Maybe Nabu detective will tell us more on this case, but as far as I know, this case is at the final stage of investigation. But the biggest problem is we don't know what will happen with this in the court. We know about one more case, and that is of Konstantin Kulik, who's the former prosecutor of ATO forces, and that was the first case which was referred to the court, but this case doesn't progress. There are meetings once in 3 or 4 months. Kulik's lawyers delay the process, and we see no prospects that the case will be finished and that some assets will be alienated or seized. Also, In this case, is about the mother who has several apartments in Diplomat Hall in Kiev. The biggest problem is how to return these assets. Even if the National Anti-Corruption Bureau works well, it's all stopped at the court. We know that the law on the highest anti-corruption court was approved, but it will take a year to create it. So it will take 2-3 years basically when we can talk about some sentences or about some real cases of confiscation. What about what happened to Demchina after this publication? Did he contact you? No, he didn't contact. He feels great.
He was the first deputy head of the Security Service of Ukraine, and the only thing that happened to him was that the president promoted him to lieutenant general, from 1-star general to 2-star general. Well, I cannot comment on that because it's not even within the province of my department, because even before the fest, when I started making inquiries, I was warned that I shouldn't, proceed in my attempts to investigate that, because the investigation was already being done by the other journalists, and they cautioned me, warned me against, publicizing things that they have been trying to identify or clarify. Therefore, according to my information, the court proceedings have have hardly been initiated, and so as well as you, we are also waiting for any possible developments, any possible progress. But what are the prospects if it is proven that his assets have been gained illicitly? What are the prospects that his assets will be confiscated? Well, the procedure is that upon the court decision, only after that the confiscation procedure is launched. Yes, but if another question is, as he is the first deputy head of the Security Service of Ukraine, does that complicate your investigation? Well, certainly you might understand that if you are trying to investigate someone who is in the security apparatus, has such a high-ranking position, whether you proceed officially or unofficially, it's very, very difficult. And as the fact of the tax return was mentioned, and you know it only too well that what was the attitude towards the publication of the tax returns of the military prosecutor's office. We, according to our investigation, he was not involved in any operational, so to say, activity. Therefore, we could not understand why his tax return was made secret. He could hardly be an object or a target for the terrorists. Oh, okay, I understood. Well, so in conclusion, we can say that that case was initiated, the court proceedings were initiated, so it's under review in the court. And please let you inform us about a different set of cases related to Prime Minister Groisman. Well, as you know, Volodymyr Groisman is the Prime Minister of the government of Ukraine. He came in 2015 from Vinnytsia to Kiev, and allegedly he has not bought any real estate in Kiev. It appears, though, that he resides in an apartment that belongs formally to a certain Ms. Burlaka, Nina Ippolitovna, who appears to be the mother-in-law of Mr. Groisman's, and she's a pensioner. In Vinnytsia, while in Vinnytsia, she was working at some railway, repair shop. But the flat where he resides, Mr. Groisman resides now, is located in one of the best and most fashionable areas in town. It's Pechersk. Here you can see Ms. Sedilets, who is the author of this report, video report, and the text of that video report. Well, so it was interesting for us because Mr. Groisman positions himself as a man who came to the premieres post after some period of entrepreneurial activity. But as we have seen for ourselves in his tax returns, there are no real estates indicated or any property, residential property, such as a flat or something like that. We were searching for some, more or less legal explanation of the reason why his income is not in the tax return and or tax declaration, as it is called in Ukraine. Maybe there are some legitimate reasons for keeping that confidential. We asked his secretary about that, his personal assistant, but he refused to discuss that with us. And the only reply that we managed to get was that, our family, the Groisman family, is large, and we have a lot of people in our family. They have various incomes, and this apartment was bought by the money allegedly collected, probably by the members of the family. It's a flat of 240 square meters of area, and Mr. Groisman apparently resides there now. But as there have been no wrongdoings found by the National Corruption Prevention Bureau, Mr. Groisman continues living there in that apartment. And if I'm not mistaken, a proprietary of the apartment are considered to be Mr. Groisman's sister and and her husband, and she used a very economical model, car of a very economical model. It's a Zhiguli, which is a rather obsolete car. And when we started asking her about the cost of that property, of that flat, how much did they pay and where did they get money for it, she couldn't give any answer. That's one story. And the second story is this story about an MP, a member of parliament, Mr. Granovsky, who is a personal friend of Mr. Poroshenko's, and we have already produced a number of films, documentaries about him, and in which we show that he's been very influential. He has been a high-ranking official of the Prosecutor General's office, or influenced that office's operation. And as we have noticed, some of the cars that Mr. Granovsky has used are Audi 8 and very expensive cars. Some of them are armored cars. But in his tax return, none of these cars has ever been mentioned. When asked about these cars, these vehicles, he gave a reply that he has been renting them from a car rent company. It's apparently it is a company that is controlled by an official from the traffic police of Ukraine, and we were not able to identify the cost of these vehicles. The vehicles themselves are registered to the names of the people who either have worked or continue working with Mr. Barsuk, who is a close friend of Mr. Granovsky's. So the cars that have been used by Mr. Granovsky, they are registered to the names of the people who are close friends, or rather worked in a company that belonged to Mr. Barsuk, who is the friend of Mr. Granovsky. We checked upon these people, and we couldn't identify any one of them whose income was higher than 250,000 hryvnias a year, which means that they could not possibly buy these vehicles with the money that they had earned. Then we inspected or examined rather the real estate of Mr. Granovsky's. He apparently is using a house in Kozin. It's a small town not far from Kiev. The house was bought by a young gentleman who is again a friend of Mr. Barsuk's, this friend of Mr. Granovsky's. So this young gentleman bought that bought that house as a mortgage, and then he rented it immediately, having mortgaged it to a lady whose name is Miss Yakubova. So her name is Yakubova, and MP Granovsky, Member of Parliament Granovsky, also uses another apartment. Here we have a video version of this report. Thank you, Natalia. So that there is another flat that belongs to another person, and so that Miss Yakubova, speaking about that first flat, Miss Yakubova rented that apartment to, or sub-rented that apartment to Mr. Granovsky. So Mr. Granovsky resides in a house that is not shown in his tax return and or tax declaration, and so our understanding is that Mr. Granovsky can and is using the whole fleet of different vehicles that are registered either to different companies or to a company that is owned by the former official of the traffic police of Ukraine. A lot of interesting references. Well, in reality, we have identified that house accidentally. By chance, sorry, not accidentally, but which is the same, but so we started investigating, and that's how we found out that it's registered to the name of a gentleman who was a lawyer of a company that belonged to Mr. Barsuk, who is a friend of Mr. Granovsky's. So we have been for 2 years watching him using these luxury cars, like two cars, Audi 8, and then two Mercedeses and two Range Rovers. Then Mercedes Vito was purchased recently, which means that it's a lot of money, and that money did not belong to the people to whom these vehicles are registered. That former traffic policeman, he is in fact now looking for a work of a driver, and he told us that he couldn't remember how much money did he pay for one of the vehicles when we confronted him with this information about these vehicles, one of them at least. So here we tried to make some graphs, trying to display here the interlinks, so to say, between different persons and entities. And when having analyzed that, we started asking Mr. Granovsky, putting questions to Mr. Granovsky, and his reply was that he has not been using these vehicles, but in this material of ours, we have proven that Mr. Granovsky has all these vehicles in his personal use. And we were informed by the lawyers that this is rather a typical scheme of that many people use who do not want to show expensive vehicles in their tax returns. Mr. Granovsky resides in a building that is really 3 minutes away, 3 minutes walk away from the building where, from the house where the President of Ukraine himself lives. So that's the information about Mr. Granovsky. We have not yet have received any formal information, any formal replies to our requests, and we could not find Mr. Granovsky in the building of the Parliament of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine. He obviously uses different entrances so that the Ukrainian journalists and even foreign journalists could not even intercept him, so to say, in the building, in the lobby of the Parliament in order to interview him. But how did he reply to you? Did he give you a written reply, or was it an oral reply? Well, I called him, and he answered the phone, and he said that he didn't have time, or for some reason he couldn't give answers to my questions, and he asked me to write, to put my questions down and send them to him. And as we frequently see Mr. Granovsky near entering or exiting various buildings, governmental buildings, like administration of the president, the cabinet of ministers, the National Bank of Ukraine, and so on and so forth, security service of Ukraine. So in the evening, you can usually spot Mr. Granovsky at one of these, or near one of these buildings, but it's impossible to question him or to interview him. Well, you use this, investigative style, like tracing the cars or tracking the cars and so on and so forth. Do you have any special database? I know that you have a number of plate numbers of different vehicles that the MPs use and the government officials use. Haven't you ever been accused, for example, by any of the officials about spying, watching them constantly? Well, as they are public officials, public administration officials, we do not violate any laws in the course of our work, and we have been pursuing the issues that are of public importance, importance for the society, and so we have never been confronted by any authority, and there have been no attempts to disrupt our investigative activity. But they probably are annoyed. I mean, the officials whom you investigate, well, they couldn't influence me or counteract me if not somewhere in the subway, because I use the subway to go to work and back from work. They complicate our work by, for example, changing the cards that they use or the plate numbers of these cars and re-registering them and so on. But we identify these changes and we continue our investigating activities. But do you use any of these, like covers when you use the subway, when you go down into the metro? Have you been?
We are not seeing any bodyguards. Basically, they know me, they know the cameraman, they know the drivers. Do you have any plans to change the way you look? No, not me. Okay, that's a good story. Artem, could you provide comments? I wanted to mention one thing. During the break, I talked to some journalists. Not everyone knows that. Maybe you heard that in the anti-corruption committees, they provide explanations. An anti-corruption agency gives the explanation if the person hasn't been using the property as of the 31st of December, then this property cannot be mentioned in the... They may not mention this property in their declaration. Then all lawyers know that, and the agency explained that if they have not found any violations in the e-declaration, then we as the prejudicial body, we have no right to file the criminal case. According to the articles, not introducing information into e-declaration. And now some judges, according to Article 212 of the Criminal Code, the prosecutor can start investigation having information from any source, even if this is the information from the internet. And any additional check from the anti-corruption agency, that is not required. But unfortunately, some courts, and we sometimes even have discussions with the prosecutor's office, they believe that such explanations are to be applied. Talking about explanations, we know that Elena Shervin told about that, but we prove not just that MP Granovsky did not declare the use of cars, but we have proven that these things are registered in the name of some people who had no income, sufficient income to buy these apartments or cars. But you understand, if a person all the year drives the Mercedes that he or she bought, but on the 31st of December puts this car not into own garage, just walks or drives something else, that's it. Has the right not to declare. That's great explanation. I believe that all officials are happy. You cannot imagine how many cases which are being investigated do not move forward because of that item. Talking about these two stories, please provide comments whether the Bureau was interested, do you know whether the cases were filed. I will ask my colleagues, but I know. From what I know, almost all journalist investigations are registered in somewhere. What are the prospects? You saw, you heard as the detective. Are there any prospects that these assets to prove that these assets were obtained illegally, and is there any perspective that these assets will be returned to the budget? With Dimchina, we understand that the cases were filed, but still we should wait for years till this could be returned to the budget. From what I saw in that program, from the professional point of view, I see that this could be proven, documented, and filed to the court. There are no complications with that. But nevertheless, if there are no difficulties with that, why there's no case filed? I don't agree completely. I don't know whether there is an official confirmation. Maybe there is. Please request the Bureau. Maybe there is some prospects. Thank you. I will give the floor to Elena Loginova. In the end, we'll have a Q&A session. We have many speakers, but very little time left. Олена Логинова, Следство Info. Investigation that we did for OCCRP together with BBC. We prepared the printed version. That is a simple story about the poor mayor from Odessa, about his luxurious apartment in London. Same apartment, Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt wanted to buy similar apartment, but they didn't do that because big taxes were to be paid. The wife of Trukhanov, Tatiana Kaltunova, and his elderly daughter, Katerina Trukhanova, bought an apartment in the center of London for almost £4 million, which is more than $5 million. Back in 2016, we learned this information from some papers, because this apartment is registered in BIV, and we do not see any final the final beneficiaries. Only thanks to Panama Papers and other papers, Paradise Papers, we can see something. The apartment was bought by a company which was called Peninsula Property. It was registered as offshore in Quadra Azura, and we saw two ladies there, Tatiana Kaltunova and Katerina Trukhanova. We've been working with the OCCRP. We went to London and we managed to observe this property. When we just came to the house, the concierge said, sorry, we cannot let you in, we cannot get you in contact with the owners, we cannot confirm who lives there, and we had to spend some time in the garden opposite and to see who lives there. On the 5th floor, in 30 minutes, we saw a man who went to the balcony. It was difficult to see who he was because he stood his back to us, but that wasn't Trukhanov. That was a nice young man. Then we started looking at what are the details. There was a table and a chair. We went back home because concierge told us that there are not such people here. We showed him the photographs of daughter, wife of Trukhanov. He said, no, I don't know the names, but if I saw such people, I would have remembered them. And then in a couple of days of such observation, we were there, our colleagues from BBC, then a girl went out to the balcony. We knew this girl. She's younger than us. She's Anya Angel. She's the daughter of one criminal, the member of oil mafia. According to Italian police, Alexander Angert, a very dangerous person who was involved into different schemes related to drugs and weapons trafficking, and the mayor of Odessa was in this group. He was the bodyguard of one of the members of this group. And we see the daughter of Angert in the apartment, which was bought by the wife and daughter of Trukhanov. And we think, how is that possible? Trukhanov himself, in the interview to Anya and Tina, said and that he didn't see him for 25 years. But here we see this direct connection. Then there are 3 cases on Trukhanov. When asked by our colleague about real estate abroad, he said no. We asked whether the family has real estate, but he did not provide any answer. Called the BBC journalist provocators. And then these 2 ladies, they have business, but they could not earn so much for this real estate because all their companies, according to public data, earn up to 200,000 hryvnias a year. Trukhanov's salary is $300 a month. How can you buy an apartment worth $5 million? And we were trying to find an answer. Maybe he bought this apartment because he's involved into some construction company that wins tenders for construction of roads, but Trukhanov denies that he's involved into this group. Then NABU detectives conducted a search in the apartment of the wife, found his properties, and this way this connection was confirmed. What happened next? I don't know. I connected the colleagues who are working on this case. He said that the prejudicial investigation is going on. They succeeded. Who succeeded? You all succeeded. I want to explain. When you participate in such things, you want to say, oh, this case We interrogated those. We found that during the search, maybe we will finalize it, but taking into account the interests of the investigation and that there are some, and that the case is not finalized, I can say that the prejudicial investigation is going on. I believe it will finish up and we'll be all glad, happy. Today we were saying that in Britain this new law became effective if you cannot explain the origin of money for which you bought the real estate, this real estate could be taken away from you. But what will happen if you communicate that to British law enforcement bodies? Will they return it to us or will they leave it for them? That's a very interesting question because the real estate is theirs, but the money is ours. But taking into account that we do not have any sentences, we're just planning to get sentences, and that's if the court starts working, then how to divide what is confiscated, this will be decided much, much later. Communication with all law enforcement, we do have communication with all law enforcement bodies of the European Union. I believe that this will be resolved. I understand that there is the pre-judicial investigation, but you published information that you had search in the apartment of Tatiana Kolotnova, so you established this connection between her and Trukhanov. The results of this search will not be part of the evidence base. Unfortunately, we have such a notion as internal conviction of the judge. If this is enough to convince the judge that they are the family, then yes. I'm happy that the agency doesn't have this explanation. If you don't live with this person on the 31st of December, then okay. Basically, the cases which are going forward, which are progressing, we cannot expect anything to happen till anti-corruption court starts operating. When anti-corruption court starts operating, I believe that's not the reason for us to stop, not to do anything. But from what I see, even looking at the cases of my department, I see the progress in the courts. In some cases, the cases were filed back in 2016, even the first judicial sitting wasn't appointed. For me, as a detective, it's not important whether the regional or special anti-corruption court will be considering that, but I understand that we will have more guarantees if we build a new court from the scratch than if we reform the old one. Now, looking at this example, the apartment of Trukhanov's family, while all these investigations are going on, he could sell it and we will never find any evidence. How often this happens when the court has to arrest it, has to seize it, and Trukhanov understands that he's under suspicion, and the civil servants of such a level, after first searches, after first active phase of prejudicial investigation, they make these attempts immediately, taking into account all this bureaucratic procedure. It takes time to for the court to make decision on the seizure of the property. The person, depending on the position, can do something. And there are such risks. We're trying to do it as quickly as possible, but there's always the risk. Then there are many different rulings of the administrative and regional courts. Kulik is trying to prove that the person with who he resides, they're not the family. I believe when it's up to, when it's about such millions, few people think about love. Okay, now let's move to Nadia Bourdieu.
Please give the microphone to Nadia Bourdi. Your investigation about Mr. Leshkov, the leader of the Radical Party, what do you know about any progress in this case? Have there been any court prosecutions? Well, we started with investigating a story about the privatization of one of the state-run enterprises, the factory that produced the firefighting equipment. It became clear to us that the Radical Party refused to vote for the annual national budget unless 300 million hryvnias are invested in that enterprise. We wanted to investigate, to examine this situation more attentively, and we addressed Mr. Leshkov, the leader of the Radical Party himself. And it so happened that in 2017, a person that had never been before in business, hadn't been an owner of any company, any enterprise, never managed any company, acquired the real estate in Kozin, not far from Kiev, for 15 million hryvnias. And it was the spouse, the wife of that person, also bought a 300 square meters a house without any prior entrepreneurial income. For some time, she had been for some time working as an administrator of the game parlor. And if we take, for example, the fleet of the vehicles that are at Mr. Leshkov's disposal, it's a fairly impressive fleet of corporate fleet, if we may say so, or party fleet of vehicles. So when we started our investigation and talked with Mr. Leshkov, he promised us to declare all his assets. Highlighting the fact that he was working very intensely, he was very busy. Mr. Leshkov's mother was working as in a heating installation in a village not far from Kiev. She started her career, so to say, in Kiev with buying 2 apartments and then reselling them at a profit. Mr. Leshkov's wife, besides the house of 300 square meters in 2017, when we were investigating that situation, she was guiding a car that was registered to the name of the person who was at that time no longer alive. As we can see now, that car was re-registered to Mr. Leshkov's wife's name. So in all these years, Mr. Leshkov has gathered some assets, and probably he's now receiving some interest on his properties and assets. And he bought, as you know from the press, a 20 million worth house. And in a video report that we broadcast, it was shown that there was the office of his party, where indeed there was a secretariat of the party, and then it was sold But when we checked again after some time, we saw that the party headquarters were still there. So it was obviously an operation of selling some property and thereby, without declaring the profits, the income that was generated. And there was a criminal case initiated, criminal investigation at least. The investigation continues. It is continuing now. And according to the materials of Biggest Info, and we'll show sometime later some statistics. I think that if I'm not mistaken, I was gathering information of about a dozen criminal cases. In this case, there was a number of people involved who allegedly were business people, but in reality they never were involved in any business activity. But so, to cut a long story short, Mr. Leshko's operations with real estate have brought some income to him. So it's now much easier for him to declare a certain amount of income. My question is then, how difficult it is to work with the people of like Mr. Leshko, who is a leader of the faction in the parliament. We spoke before about the deputy head of the security service of Ukraine. According to you, who is more difficult to investigate, the public officials or the politicians? Well, public officials. It's difficult really to investigate them. For example, we investigate, our team, for example, investigates the misappropriation of a flat by one of the deputy ministers of healthcare. And I'd say that it's quite difficult to investigate. Have you been approached by any of them whom you investigate? No, not yet, but I believe that it might happen. For example, we experienced some pressure, and Mr. Leshko, for example, when he was asked to make a deposition, he started offending the detectives and threatening them. And well, what was were there any reaction from Mr. Leshko himself? Well, we expected some reaction from him, but after he learned about our investigation, and we approached him, there was silence for a few days, and then a few days later there was an interview by Mr. Leshko, video interview, he recorded a video where he disproved all the accusations, and so those who were interviewing him, they didn't ask any questions about the sources of his income or any of his dubious commercial operations. And you mentioned also, for example, the fact that he was sweared and he, was trying to offend the detectives who interrogated him or asked him to make a deposition. Well, the detectives are quite used to that. Every second interrogation might be described as a conflict situation with mutual accusations and so forth. Well, but we know that if an ordinary citizen, just rank and file citizen, tries to confront physically any of the law enforcement officials, he is punished for that. Is it so for the politicians? Well, or officials? Well, you remember the situation when the deputy head of the tax inspection of Ukraine was taken, an attempt was made to transfer him from the hospital where he went when the investigation started to the local court, one of the local courts in Kiev. His supporters were, blocking the vehicle, lying on the land, on the road where the car was supposed to move, and so on and so forth. Let me show your slides. Can you comment on the cases that we have already mentioned? How do you manage, for example, to identify what information that the investigative journalists uncover? How do you identify which information is interesting for you and which is not? Ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you that apart from being an investigator, I'm also please do not make any video streaming from here with me, because I'm also an operative. I have also operational function in my line of work. And I frequently go to similar gatherings and professional meetings, and sometimes I see my face on the photographs that are published afterwards. But so far, luckily, I haven't had any problems. No, I could continue to follow, to tail even, if I may say so, the investigated officials. Speaking about the information that concerns those officials that are investigated both formally and informally, I can say that for any of those officials, you can add, in addition to the information that you put on the screen, 2 more screens full of information. And Mr. Klick's investigation was most memorable for me. It concerned the backpacks that were purchased by the Defense Ministry. This case is now being prosecuted. It's being examined in the court, and let me tell you that the courts they use the materials that are gathered and published by the investigative journalists. And when we take this information that concerns the officials, their wrongdoings, when we take this information from various open sources, it's invaluable to us. And describing the other venues where the NABU, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, can cooperate with the journalists, the opportunities are unlimited, really. If we take, for example, the tax evasion and the cases when, especially when certain assets were not declared by a number of officials, when these data, this information is published, it saves us a lot of time and effort, because we already can use that information, because we know that it's been checked and verified. But on the other hand, those who the subjects of those investigations, after they see that information about them is published, they become more cautious and reserved. Then I know that a number of projects has been supported by some lawyers, and in many cases the information that was uncovered, for example, it provides a foundation for the prosecution, and we at NABU also receive that information. Sometimes it happens so that if some information is lacking in the declaration, some people immediately think that this was an attempt to, somehow abuse this information by not publishing it, to somehow conceal that information. It sometimes happens that people who declare their assets not being lawyers might just be mistaken, and it might happen so that in the court then it appears that they, for some objective reasons, didn't declare this or the other type of asset. And but for the journalists, it's easier sometimes to gather the information because we need to address, for example, foreign governments officially, making formal requests, requesting the information, and it takes a lot of time. Frequently, we sometimes try to use our personal contacts. And here, I think the personal contacts with investigative journalists who can get some information rather quickly using their own channels, that is very valuable to us, and we appreciate that very much. And there were many situations when the journalists helped us gathering this information much quicker than we would otherwise be able to. Then let me draw your attention to the fact that our jurisdiction is quite limited. We cannot investigate all the officials. One thing is the judges and the members of the law enforcement authorities. But it happens so that in the course of our investigation, we are gathering sometimes the information about the other people who are not directly direct subjects of our investigation. But we would certainly be glad to share that information with you. It would be very useful for your investigations. Well, in that case of which you asked me, there was not our jurisdiction directly again, but there was a lot of information gathered that would be a perfect investigative, reporting, very interesting from the point of view of mass media. But again, sometimes it happens that when we contact you and we want to formalize your information, we need to do that because without official minutes and official documents where the evidence is reported by you and signed and so on, it's difficult to use that information in the courts of law. Well, my question is that in many cases that seemingly were in your jurisdiction, many cases and criminal prosecutions ended up within the Prosecutor General's office. Well, it's because in the transitional provisions of the law on the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, a number of changes was made, and our jurisdiction was changed. These changes were logical to an extent because if there is, an investigator of NABU who is the only official who is supposed to investigate this or the other case, where you have like a few thousand pages of materials, but it would take him years probably, even to you know, to read and study all the materials. So sometimes our efforts are coupled with the efforts of the Prosecutor General's office, and the situation is more difficult when the case goes to the court, and there it stays for a year or even more without even being read by anyone. From your experience, how satisfied are the journalists with whom you cooperate? What's your impression? Well, my impression is that the journalists are happy to cooperate with us, because and we are also happy to cooperate with them, because for you it's we are the means of you know, getting new information and make it public, and for us your materials and your information is can be used as the proof for you know, for as a proof and evidence in the court of law. And so you should understand that any investigation of that sort, of any high-ranking official, should it needs a lot of evidence and proofs. And sometimes, having used your materials, we feel tempted, you know, to boast, to show off that we have gathered this and that material, but in the interest of the investigation, we usually abstain from doing that.
I would like to ask you whether you are satisfied with the cooperation with the NABU. Oleg said about something in the morning. We're talking about NABU. Other bodies which were planning to join us here yesterday, the General Prosecutor's Office and the representative of the Speaker instead of the Deputy General Prosecutor Arma didn't show up. Are you happy, for example? As a witness, yes, but I signed something. If I learned something, I have no right to disclose. Talking about interrogation, yes. Talking about material where we know that there is a prejudicial investigation going on, then no. We cannot disclose, but that's the law. So at this stage, yes, but we're interested in cooperation, and materials are of interest. What could be done to improve it? What could be done? Here, I cannot say possibly this mechanism, can we improve it? Talking about preparing some material, and we know that NABU is investigating, and very often what we prepare does not get to the court register, but we know that NABU requested the permit to conduct the search, and this way we could probably improve the mechanism of cooperation. You mean when the investigation is over, but it's not in the register? If you prepared some materials which are at NABU and investigation, the only correct mechanism for you would be establishing interaction with the detective who's involved into this investigation. I understand that the journalist investigation is something like you want to learn what's happening there informally. You can establish cooperation, ensuring confidentiality, you can get some information. But officially, there's a long bureaucratic corridor of approvals, and to get something more than usual is hardly possible. This should be in the judicial register. Very often when we come with an official request, Sometimes they write which detective, and you can address him. Very often detectives agree to cooperate, but very often they say that pre-judicial investigation is going on. Then the question is why in some cases it works, in other cases it doesn't. But can we request these documents from you? I can tell you. I believe that getting approval is not very efficient way. When we submit the request to the court, we write about temporary access and we request, despite the fact that this is not provided for by the closed judicial sitting, we request them not to publish such materials very often. For you, this is the information which will give you information on your investigation, but for someone else, they can use this information and we request not to do that. So the main thing is to communicate with detectives and try to establish this communication. What do you think? I was interrogated once. I'm ready to answer questions because myself and our team are interested in the results. What could be done better? I have two cases. I wasn't interrogated on either one of them, so it's difficult to say. I believe it's not just about interrogation, but we would like to see some result. I would like to add, you need to understand that sometimes things happen which worsen the global communication. If you remember, in 2016 there was off-records communication with Artem Sitnik, our director, and this year we got the recording of this communication. You need to understand that after such cases, the relations with the journalist community goes down. You know who because of who it was, there was a leakage? I don't know. But what I mean is that any extra information which got from one journalist and which was clear that it will not be in the interests of the investigation, it creates bad impression of journalist community, and it will be more difficult for you to establish communication. On two of my investigations, the criminal cases were filed, but first case is Demchina's case that we mentioned, and the second one is it's on the head of the Academy of Land Forces in Lviv, and the situation was that the detectives prepared the suspicion, but then there was some conflict with SAP, and SAP closed this case, and Nabu appealed against it in the court, but I found out about that post factum. It's not a close type information. If we learned about that when Nabu went to the court, when the court made the decision on whether it was correctly or not to close this proceeding, maybe the result would be different, because now the case was closed and we just buried it. By the way, on this case, when I talked to the colleagues, which cases we can discuss at this fest, my colleagues mentioned that, and now my colleagues are for mentioning this illegal closure. But you see what's happening. If you have some contact person who was working on this case from Nabu, then I believe it would be great if you develop the communication. I wasn't interrogated. In fact, talking about Paradise Papers, there were Ukrainian personalities involved, and I was asked unofficially, but I never went to official interrogation. Paradise and Panama Papers, I haven't heard. There was on the president, and I said no. Who can investigate the president? What about Panama Papers, Paradise Papers? As far as I know, the materials of Panama Papers are not used because it's not just about the president. I worked with that and Elena, and no one sent any request. People say that the major problem is that all these materials, this is the information, but for it to become the evidence, we need to confirm it. Could it be that we don't know, but you do the same, and that often happens? On cooperation, thank you for coming. It's a pleasure talking to you, but journalists and law enforcement people, we're independent from each other. We wish you all success. Good luck. We have many questions. I have a question to detective. I am a practicing lawyer, and I'd like to hear from the representative of NABU. You were saying that we're dealing with the judges, and I'm interested. How many judges, how many cases were transferred to the court? I will give you one example. The Judge Tsiluk, I am the coordinator of the project, and we were investigating the case when the tractor driver is in prison instead of some other person. Lutsenko knows about this case. He says, okay, write the complaint to the European Court. We wrote the application to the application to the European Court. Soon, hopefully, we will have the decision on this case. They held him 120 days in the embankment, and the question is, we started the journalist investigation on Tsaruk, and we saw 10 cars. His wife works in the Mykolaievsky Court of Appeal. He is related to criminal elements. So can you put it brief? The question is, how many cases are there? Was at least the single one transferred to the court? Why there are no investigations? There are many facts on this guy. I am the moderator. And one more thing now, after communicating this case to the court, European Court, our activists who went to court, they received in good. You can talk to detective. We are now discussing the cases on assets of the civil servants. In Nabu, we have thousands of criminal cases. Was there a submission to Nabu? Okay, we'll discuss it outside. We have transfers. Don't answer. You can talk later. We have a certain plan. Any questions on journalists? I have a question. I'm interested in why the case of Rosenblatt is falling apart, and can Nabu make the top officials responsible? Is that something that the detectives didn't work on? Is there corruption in the courts? Why, parallel to that case, you are not investigating those who give the Rosenblatt the chance to be unpunished? It's not clear what's the conclusion. Why do you believe that the case is falling apart? I believe that other department is working on that, and the line of defense of Rosenblatt is such that they position it as provocation. We have discussed it many times. We believe that without provocation, and it's according to the criteria according to which this is provocation or not. I don't know why you believe that it's developing as to corruption of courts, of judges. There are two main articles. First, receiving some profit. The cases cannot be proven post factum, as well as without the control of one of the parties. When we have the person from who they demand the bribe, he goes to meet with the intermediary.
And but if we do not have an opportunity to control any of the sides involved, we cannot control and subsequently prosecute that case. There was a question about the situations when the judges are making judgments that are not do not have sufficient grounds. It's not at all within the province of Nabu's jurisdiction. So if you want to you know, to narrow your question down, I'd be happy to answer it. Two more questions, please.